Chapter 14. That first week, the wisteria began to fade, and the flowers of the Judas tree and peach trees fell off and carpeted the ground with rose colour. Then all the freesias disappeared, and the irises grew scarce. And then, while these were clearing themselves away, the double Banksia roses came out, and the big summer roses suddenly flaunted gorgeously on the walls and trellises. Fortune's yellow was one of them, a very beautiful rose. Presently the tamarisk and the daphnes were at their best, and the lilies at their tallest. By the end of the week, the fig trees were giving shade, the plum blossom was out among the olives, the modest weigelas appeared in their fresh pink clothes, and on the rocks sprawled masses of thick-leaved, star-shaped flowers, some vivid purple, and some a clear, pale lemon. By the end of the week, too, Mr. Wilkins arrived. Even as his wife had foreseen he would, so he did. And there were signs almost of eagerness about his acceptance of her suggestion, for he had not waited to write a letter in answer to hers, but had telegraphed. That surely was eager. It showed, Scrap thought, a definite wish for reunion, and watching his wife's happy face, and aware of her desire that Mellersh should enjoy his holiday, she told herself that he would be a very unusual fool should he waste his time bothering about anybody else. If he isn't nice to her, Scrap thought, he shall be taken to the battlements and tipped over. For, by the end of the week, she and Mrs. Wilkins had become Caroline and Lottie to each other, and were friends. Mrs. Wilkins had always been friends, but Scrap had struggled not to be. She had tried hard to be cautious, but how difficult was caution with Mrs. Wilkins? Free herself from every vestige of it, she was so entirely unreserved, so completely expansive, that soon Scrap, almost before she knew what she was doing, was being unreserved too. And nobody could be more unreserved than Scrap, once she let herself go. The only difficulty about Lottie was that she was nearly always somewhere else. You couldn't catch her. You couldn't pin her down to come and talk. Scrap's fears that she would grab seemed grotesque in retrospect. Why, there was no grab in her. At dinner and after dinner were the only times one really saw her. All day long she was invisible, and would come back in the late afternoon looking a perfect sight, her hair full of bits of moss, and her freckles worse than ever. Perhaps she was making the most of her time before Mellersh arrived to do all the things she wanted to do, and meant to devote herself afterwards to going about with him, tidy, and in her best clothes. Scrap watched her, interested in spite of herself, because it seemed so extraordinary to be as happy as all that on so little. San Salvatore was beautiful, and the weather was divine, but scenery and weather had never been enough for Scrap. And how could they be enough for somebody who would have to leave them quite soon and go back to life in Hampstead? Also, there was the imminence of Mellersh, of that Mellersh from whom Lottie had so lately run. It was all very well to feel one ought to share, and to make a beau geste and do it, but the beau geste Scrap had known hadn't made anybody happy. Nobody really liked being the object of one. It always meant an effort on the part of the maker. Still, she had to admit there was no effort about Lottie. It was quite plain that everything she did and said was effortless, and that she was just simply, completely happy. And so Mrs. Wilkins was. For her doubts as to whether she had had time to become steady enough in serenity to go on being serene in Mellersh's company, when she had it uninterruptedly right round the clock, had gone by the middle of the week, and she felt that nothing now could shake her. She was ready for anything. She was firmly grafted, rooted, built into heaven. Whatever Mellersh said or did, she would not budge an inch out of heaven, would not rouse herself a single instant to come outside it and be cross. On the contrary, she was going to pull him up into it beside her, and they would sit comfortably together, suffused in light, and laugh at how much afraid of him she used to be in Hampstead, and at how deceitful her afraidness had made her. But he wouldn't need much pulling. He would come in quite naturally after a day or two, irresistibly wafted on the scented breezes of that divine air, and there he would sit, arrayed in stars, thought Mrs. Wilkins, in whose mind, among much other debris, floated occasional bright shreds of poetry. She laughed to herself a little at the picture of Mellersh, that top-hatted, black-coated, respectable family solicitor, arrayed in stars. But she laughed affectionately, almost with a maternal pride in how splendid he would look in such fine clothes. "Poor lamb," she murmured to herself affectionately, and added, "What he wants is a thorough airing." This was during the first half of the week. By the beginning of the last half, at the end of which Mr. Wilkins arrived, she left off even assuring herself that she was unshakable, that she was permeated beyond altering by the atmosphere. She no longer thought of it or noticed it. She took it for granted. If one may say so, and she certainly said so, not only to herself but also to Lady Caroline, she had found her celestial legs. Contrary to Mrs. Fisher's idea of the seemly, but of course, contrary, what else would one expect of Mrs. Wilkins? She did not go to meet her husband at Mezzago, but merely walked down to the point where Beppo's fly would leave him and his luggage in the street of Castagneto. Mrs. Fisher disliked the arrival of Mr. Wilkins, and was sure that anybody who could have married Mrs. Wilkins must be at least of an injudicious disposition. But a husband, whatever his disposition, should be properly met. Mr. Fisher had always been properly met. Never once in his married life had he gone unmet at a station, nor had he ever not been seen off. These observances, these courtesies, strengthened the bonds of marriage, and made the husband feel he could rely on his wife's being always there. Always being there was the essential secret for a wife. What would have become of Mr. Fisher if she had neglected to act on this principle? She preferred not to think. Enough things became of him as it was. For whatever one's care in stopping up, married life yet seemed to contain chinks. But Mrs. Wilkins took no pains. She just walked down the hill singing, Mrs. Fisher could hear her, and picked up her husband in the street as casually as if he were a pin. The three others, still in bed, for it was not nearly time to get up, heard her as she passed beneath their windows down the zigzag path to meet Mr. Wilkins, who was coming by the morning train. And Scrap smiled, and Rose sighed, and Mrs. Fisher rang her bell and desired Francesca to bring her breakfast in her room. All three had breakfast that day in their rooms, moved by a common instinct to take cover. Scrap always breakfasted in bed, but she had the same instinct for cover, and during breakfast she made plans for spending the whole day where she was. Perhaps, though, it wouldn't be as necessary that day as the next. That day, Scrap calculated, Mellersh would be provided for. He would want to have a bath, and having a bath at San Salvatore was an elaborate business, a real adventure if one had a hot one in the bathroom, and it took a lot of time. It involved the attendance of the entire staff. Domenico and the boy Giuseppe coaxing the patent stove to burn, restraining it when it burnt too fiercely, using the bellows to it when it threatened to go out, relighting it when it did go out. Francesca anxiously hovering over the tap, regulating its trickle, because if it were turned on too full, the water instantly ran cold, and if not full enough, the stove blew up inside and mysteriously flooded the house. And Costanza and Angela running up and down, bringing pails of hot water from the kitchen to eke out what the tap did. This bath had been put in lately, and was at once the pride and the terror of the servants. It was very patent. Nobody quite understood it. There were long printed instructions as to its right treatment hanging on the wall, in which the word pericoloso recurred. When Mrs. Fisher, proceeding on her arrival to the bathroom, saw this word, she went back to her room again, and ordered a sponge bath instead. And when the others found what using the bathroom meant, and how reluctant the servants were to leave them alone with the stove, and how Francesca positively refused to, and stayed with her back turned watching the tap, and how the remaining servants waited anxiously outside the door till the bather came safely out again, they too had sponge baths brought into their rooms instead. Mr. Wilkins, however, was a man, and would be sure to want a big bath. Having it, Scrap calculated, would keep him busy for a long while. Then he would unpack, and then, after his night in the train, he would probably sleep till the evening. So would he be provided for the whole of that day, and not be let loose on them till dinner. Therefore, Scrap came to the conclusion she would be quite safe in the garden that day, and got up as usual after breakfast, and dawdled as usual through her dressing, listening with a slightly cocked ear to the sounds of Mr. Wilkins's arrival, of his luggage being carried into Lottie's room on the other side of the landing, of his educated voice as he inquired of Lottie, first, "Do I give this fellow anything?" and immediately afterwards, "Can I have a hot bath?" of Lottie's voice cheerfully assuring him that he needn't give the fellow anything, because he was the gardener, and that yes, he could have a hot bath. And soon after this, the landing was filled with the familiar noises of wood being brought, of water being brought, of feet running, of tongues vociferating, in fact, with the preparation of the bath. Scrap finished dressing, and then loitered at her window, waiting till she should hear Mr. Wilkins go into the bathroom. When he was safely there, she would slip out and settle herself in her garden, and resume her inquiries into the probable meaning of her life. She was getting on with her inquiries. She dozed much less frequently, and was beginning to be inclined to agree that tawdry was the word to apply to her past. Also, she was afraid that her future looked black. There, she could hear Mr. Wilkins's educated voice again. Lottie's door had opened, and he was coming out of it asking his way to the bathroom. "It's where you see the crowd," Lottie's voice answered. Still a cheerful voice, Scrap was glad to notice. His steps went along the landing, and Lottie's steps seemed to go downstairs. And then there seemed to be a brief altercation at the bathroom door. Hardly so much an altercation as a chorus of vociferations on one side and a wordless determination, Scrap judged, to have a bath by oneself on the other. Mr. Wilkins knew no Italian, and the expression pericoloso left him precisely as it found him. Or would have, if he had seen it. But naturally he took no notice of the printed matter on the wall. He firmly closed the door on the servants, resisting Domenico, who tried to the last to press through, and locked himself in as a man should for his bath, judicially considering, as he made his simple preparations for getting in, the singular standard of behaviour of these foreigners, who, both male and female, apparently wished to stay with him while he bathed. In Finland, he had heard, the female natives not only were present on such occasions, but actually washed the bath-taking traveller. He had not heard, however, that this was true too of Italy, which somehow seemed much nearer civilization. Perhaps because one went there, and did not go to Finland. Impartially examining this reflection, and carefully balancing the claims to civilization of Italy and Finland, Mr. Wilkins got into the bath and turned off the tap. Naturally, he turned off the tap. It was what one did. But on the instructions, printed in red letters, was a paragraph saying that the tap should not be turned off as long as there was still fire in the stove. It should be left on, not much on, but on, until the fire was quite out. Otherwise, and here again was the word pericoloso. The stove would blow up. Mr. Wilkins got into the bath, turned off the tap, and the stove blew up exactly as the printed instructions said it would. It blew up, fortunately, only in its inside, but it blew up with a terrific noise, and Mr. Wilkins leapt out of the bath and rushed to the door, and only the instincts born of years of training made him snatch up a towel as he rushed. Scrap, halfway across the landing on her way out of doors, heard the explosion. "Good heavens," she thought, remembering the instructions. "There goes Mr. Wilkins." And she ran toward the head of the stairs to call the servants. And as she ran, out ran Mr. Wilkins, clutching his towel, and they ran into each other. "That damned bath!" cried Mr. Wilkins, perhaps for the only time in his life forgetting himself. But he was upset. Here was an introduction. Mr. Wilkins, imperfectly concealed in his towel, his shoulders exposed at one end and his legs at the other, and Lady Caroline Dester, to meet whom he had swallowed all his anger with his wife and come out to Italy. For Lottie in her letter had told him who was at San Salvatore besides herself and Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mr. Wilkins at once had perceived that this was an opportunity which might never recur. Lottie had merely said, "There are 2 other women here, Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline Dester." But that was enough. He knew all about the Droitwiches, their wealth, their connections, their place in history, and the power they had, should they choose to exert it, of making yet another solicitor happy by adding him to those they already employed. Some people employed one solicitor for one branch of their affairs and another for another. The affairs of the Droitwiches must have many branches. He had also heard, for it was, he considered, part of his business to hear, and having heard to remember, of the beauty of their only daughter. Even if the Droitwiches themselves did not need his services, their daughter might. Beauty led one into strange situations. Advice could never come amiss. And should none of them, neither parents nor daughter, nor any of their brilliant sons, need him in his professional capacity, it yet was obviously a most valuable acquaintance to make. It opened up vistas. It swelled with possibilities. He might go on living in Hampstead for years, and not again come across such another chance. Directly his wife's letter reached him, he telegraphed and packed. This was business. He was not a man to lose time when it came to business, nor was he a man to jeopardize a chance by neglecting to be amiable. He met his wife perfectly amiably, aware that amiability under such circumstances was wisdom. Besides, he actually felt amiable. Very. For once, Lottie was really helping him. He kissed her affectionately on getting out of Beppo's fly, and was afraid she must have got up extremely early. He made no complaints of the steepness of the walk up. He told her pleasantly of his journey, and, when called upon, obediently admired the views. It was all neatly mapped out in his mind, what he was going to do that first day. Have a shave, have a bath, put on clean clothes, sleep a while. And then would come lunch, and the introduction to Lady Caroline. In the train he had selected the words of his greeting, going over them with care. Some slight expression of his gratification in meeting one of whom he, in common with the whole world, had heard, but of course put delicately, very delicately. Some slight reference to her distinguished parents, and the part her family had played in the history of England, made of course with proper tact. A sentence or two about her eldest brother, Lord Winchcombe, who had won his V.C. in the late war under circumstances which could only cause, he might or might not add this, every Englishman's heart to beat higher than ever with pride, and the first steps towards what might well be the turning point in his career would have been taken. And here he was. No. It was too terrible. What could be more terrible? Only a towel on, water running off his legs, and that exclamation. He knew at once the lady was Lady Caroline. The minute the exclamation was out, he knew it. Rarely did Mr. Wilkins use that word, and never, never in the presence of a lady or a client. While as for the towel... Why had he come? Why had he not stayed in Hampstead? It would be impossible to live this down. But Mr. Wilkins was reckoning without Scrap. She, indeed, screwed up her face at the first flash of him on her astonished sight in an enormous effort not to laugh, and having choked the laughter down and got her face serious again, she said as composedly as if he'd had all his clothes on, "How do you do?" What perfect tact! Mr. Wilkins could have worshipped her. This exquisite ignoring. Blue blood, of course, coming out. Overwhelmed with gratitude, he took her offered hand and said, "How do you do?" in his turn, and merely to repeat the ordinary words seemed magically to restore the situation to the normal. Indeed, he was so much relieved, and it was so natural to be shaking hands, to be conventionally greeting, that he forgot he had only a towel on, and his professional manner came back to him. He forgot what he was looking like, but he did not forget that this was Lady Caroline Dester, the lady he had come all the way to Italy to see, and he did not forget that it was in her face, her lovely and important face, that he had flung his terrible exclamation. He must at once entreat her forgiveness. To say such a word to a lady, to any lady, but of all ladies, to just this one. "I'm afraid I used unpardonable language," began Mr. Wilkins very earnestly and ceremoniously as if he had had his clothes on. "I thought it most appropriate," said Scrap, who was used to dams. Mr. Wilkins was incredibly relieved and soothed by this answer. No offence, then, taken. Blue blood again. Only blue blood could afford such a liberal, such an understanding attitude. "It is Lady Caroline Dester, is it not, to whom I am speaking?" he asked, his voice sounding even more carefully cultivated than usual, for he had to restrain too much pleasure, too much relief, too much of the joy of the pardoned and the shriven from getting into it. "Yes," said Scrap, and for the life of her she couldn't help smiling. She couldn't help it. She hadn't meant to smile at Mr. Wilkins, not ever. But really, he looked... And then his voice on the top of the rest of him, oblivious of the towel and his legs, and talking just like a church. "Allow me to introduce myself," said Mr. Wilkins, with the ceremony of the drawing-room. "My name is Mellersh Wilkins," and he instinctively held out his hand a second time at the words. "I thought perhaps it was," said Scrap, a second time having hers shaken, and a second time unable not to smile. He was about to proceed to the first of the graceful tributes he had prepared in the train, oblivious, as he could not see himself, that he was without his clothes, when the servants came running up the stairs, and simultaneously Mrs. Fisher appeared in the doorway of her sitting-room. For all this had happened very quickly, and the servants away in the kitchen, and Mrs. Fisher pacing her battlements, had not had time on hearing the noise to appear before the second handshake. The servants, when they heard the dreaded noise, knew at once what had happened, and rushed straight into the bathroom to try and staunch the flood, taking no notice of the figure on the landing in the towel. But Mrs. Fisher did not know what the noise could be, and coming out of her room to inquire, stood rooted on the door-sill. It was enough to root anybody. Lady Caroline, shaking hands with what evidently, if he had had clothes on, would have been Mrs. Wilkins's husband. And both of them conversing just as if... Then Scrap became aware of Mrs. Fisher. She turned to her at once. "Do let me," she said gracefully, "introduce Mr. Mellersh Wilkins. He has just come. This," she added, turning to Mr. Wilkins, "is Mrs. Fisher." And Mr. Wilkins, nothing if not courteous, reacted at once to the conventional formula. First, he bowed to the elderly lady in the doorway. Then he crossed over to her, his wet feet leaving footprints as he went, and having got to her, he politely held out his hand. "It is a pleasure," said Mr. Wilkins, in his carefully modulated voice, "to meet a friend of my wife's." Scrap melted away down into the garden. Chapter 15. The strange effect of this incident was that when they met that evening at dinner, both Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline had a singular feeling of secret understanding with Mr. Wilkins. He could not be to them as other men. He could not be to them as he would have been if they had met him in his clothes. There was a sense of broken ice. They felt at once intimate and indulgent. Almost they felt to him as nurses do, as those feel who have assisted either patients or young children at their baths. They were acquainted with Mr. Wilkins's legs. What Mrs. Fisher said to him that morning in her first shock will never be known, but what Mr. Wilkins said to her in reply, when reminded by what she was saying of his condition, was so handsome in its apology, so proper in its confusion, that she had ended by being quite sorry for him and completely placated. After all, it was an accident, and nobody could help accidents. And when she saw him next at dinner, dressed, polished, spotless as to linen and sleek as to hair, she felt this singular sensation of a secret understanding with him, and added to it, of a kind of almost personal pride in his appearance, now that he was dressed, which presently extended in some subtle way to an almost personal pride in everything he said. There was no doubt whatever in Mrs. Fisher's mind that a man was infinitely preferable as a companion to a woman. Mr. Wilkins's presence and conversation at once raised the standard of the dinner table from that of a bear garden, yes, a bear garden, to that of a civilized social gathering. He talked as men talk, about interesting subjects, and though most courteous to Lady Caroline, showed no traces of dissolving into simpers and idiocy whenever he addressed her. He was, indeed, precisely as courteous to Mrs. Fisher herself, and when for the first time at that table politics were introduced, he listened to her with the proper seriousness of her exhibiting a desire to speak, and treated her opinions with the attention they deserved. He appeared to think much as she did about Lloyd George, and in regard to literature he was equally sound. In fact, there was real conversation. And he liked nuts. How he could have married Mrs. Wilkins was a mystery. Lottie, for her part, looked on with round eyes. She had expected Mellersh to take at least 2 days before he got to this stage, but the San Salvatore spell had worked instantly. It was not only that he was pleasant at dinner, for she had always seen him pleasant at dinners with other people, but he had been pleasant all day privately. So pleasant that he had complimented her on her looks while she was brushing out her hair, and kissed her. Kissed her! And it was neither good morning nor good night. Well, this being so, she would put off telling him the truth about her nest egg, and about Rose not being his hostess after all, till next day. Pity to spoil things. She had been going to blurt it out as soon as he had had a rest, but it did seem a pity to disturb such a very beautiful frame of mind as that of Mellersh this first day. Let him too get more firmly fixed in heaven. Once fixed, he wouldn't mind anything. Her face sparkled with delight at the instantaneous effect of San Salvatore. Even the catastrophe of the bath, of which she had been told when she came in from the garden, had not shaken him. Of course, all that he needed was a holiday. What a brute she had been to him when he wanted to take her himself to Italy. But this arrangement, as it happened, was ever so much better, though not through any merit of hers. She talked and laughed gaily, not a shred of fear of him left in her. And even when she said, struck by his spotlessness, that he looked so clean that one could eat one's dinner off him, and Scrap laughed, Mellersh laughed too. He would have minded that at home, supposing that at home she had had the spirit to say it. It was a successful evening. Scrap, whenever she looked at Mr. Wilkins, saw him in his towel, dripping water, and felt indulgent. Mrs. Fisher was delighted with him. Rose was a dignified hostess in Mr. Wilkins's eyes, quiet and dignified, and he admired the way she waived her right to preside at the head of the table, as a graceful compliment, of course, to Mrs. Fisher's age. Mrs. Arbuthnot was, opined Mr. Wilkins, naturally retiring. She was the most retiring of the three ladies. He had met her before dinner alone for a moment in the drawing-room and had expressed in appropriate language his sense of her kindness in wishing him to join her party, and she had been retiring. Was she shy? Probably. She had blushed and murmured as if in deprecation, and then the others had come in. At dinner she talked least. He would, of course, become better acquainted with her during the next few days, and it would be a pleasure, he was sure. Meanwhile, Lady Caroline was all and more than all Mr. Wilkins had imagined, and had received his speeches, worked in skilfully between the courses, graciously. Mrs. Fisher was the exact old lady he had been hoping to come across all his professional life, and Lottie had not only immensely improved, but was obviously au mieux. Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in French, with Lady Caroline. He had been much tormented during the day by the thought of how he had stood conversing with Lady Caroline, forgetful of his not being dressed, and had at last written her a note most deeply apologizing, and beseeching her to overlook his amazing, his incomprehensible obliviousness, to which she had replied in pencil on the back of the envelope, "Don't worry." And he had obeyed her commands and had put it from him. The result was, he was now in great contentment. Before going to sleep that night, he pinched his wife's ear. She was amazed. These endearments. What is more, the morning brought no relapse in Mr. Wilkins, and he kept up to this high level throughout the day, in spite of its being the first day of the second week, and therefore payday. Its being payday precipitated Lottie's confession, which she had, when it came to the point, been inclined to put off a little longer. She was not afraid. She dared anything. But Mellersh was in such an admirable humour. Why risk clouding it just yet? When, however, soon after breakfast, Costanza appeared, with a pile of very dirty little bits of paper covered with sums in pencil, and having knocked at Mrs. Fisher's door and been sent away, and at Lady Caroline's door and been sent away, and at Rose's door and had no answer because Rose had gone out, she waylaid Lottie, who was showing Mellersh over the house, and pointed to the bits of paper, and talked very rapidly and loud, and shrugged her shoulders a great deal, and kept on pointing at the bits of paper. Lottie remembered that a week had passed without anybody paying anything to anyone, and that the moment had come to settle up. "Does this good lady want something?" inquired Mr. Wilkins mellifluously. "Money," said Lottie. "Money? It's the housekeeping bills." "Well, you have nothing to do with those," said Mr. Wilkins serenely. "Oh yes, I have." And the confession was precipitated. It was wonderful how Mellersh took it. One would have imagined that his sole idea about the nest egg had always been that it should be lavished on just this. He did not, as he would have done at home, cross-examine her. He accepted everything as it came pouring out, about her fibs and all. And when she finished and said, "You have every right to be angry, I think, but I hope you won't be and will forgive me instead," he merely asked, "What can be more beneficial than such a holiday?" Whereupon she put her arm through his and held it tight and said, "Oh, Mellersh, you really are too sweet," her face red with pride in him. That he should so quickly assimilate the atmosphere, that he should at once become nothing but kindness, showed surely what a real affinity he had with good and beautiful things. He belonged quite naturally in this place of heavenly calm. He was, extraordinary how she had misjudged him, by nature, a child of light. Fancy not minding the dreadful fib she had gone in for before leaving home. Fancy passing even those over without comment. Wonderful. Yet not wonderful, for wasn't he in heaven? In heaven nobody minded any of those done-with things. One didn't even trouble to forgive and forget. One was much too happy. She pressed his arm tight in her gratitude and appreciation, and though he did not withdraw his, neither did he respond to her pressure. Mr. Wilkins was of a cool habit, and rarely had any real wish to press. Meanwhile, Costanza, perceiving that she had lost the Wilkinses' ear, had gone back to Mrs. Fisher, who at least understood Italian, besides being clearly, in the servants' eyes, the one of the party marked down by age and appearance to pay the bills. And to her, while Mrs. Fisher put the final touches to her toilette, for she was preparing, by means of putting on a hat and veil and feather boa and gloves, to go for her first stroll in the lower garden, positively her first since her arrival, she explained that, unless she was given money to pay the last week's bills, the shops of Castagneto would refuse credit for the current week's food. Not even credit would they give, affirmed Costanza, who had been spending a great deal and was anxious to pay all her relations what was owed them, and also to find out how her mistresses took it for that day's meals. Soon it would be the hour of colazione. How could there be colazione without meat, without fish, without eggs, without— Mrs. Fisher took the bills out of her hand and looked at the total. And she was so much astonished by its size, so much horrified by the extravagance to which it testified, that she sat down at her writing table to go into the thing thoroughly. Costanza had a very bad half-hour. She had not supposed it was in the English to be so mercenary. And then La Vecchia, as she was called in the kitchen, knew so much Italian, and with a doggedness that filled Costanza with shame on her behalf, for such conduct was the last one expected from the noble English, she went through item after item, requiring and persisting till she got them, explanations. There were no explanations, except that Costanza had had one glorious week of doing exactly as she chose, of splendid, unbridled license, and that this was the result. Costanza, having no explanations, wept. It was miserable to think that she would have to cook from now on under watchfulness, under suspicion, And what would her relations say when they found the orders they received were whittled down? They would say she had no influence. They would despise her. Costanza wept. But Mrs. Fisher was unmoved. In slow and splendid Italian, with the roll of the cantos of the Inferno, she informed her that she would pay no bills till the following week, and that meanwhile the food was to be precisely as good as ever, and at a quarter the cost. Costanza threw up her hands. Next week, proceeded Mrs. Fisher, unmoved, if she found this had been so, she would pay the whole. Otherwise... She paused. For what she would do otherwise she did not know herself. But she paused, and looked impenetrable, majestic, and menacing, and Costanza was cowed. Then Mrs. Fisher, having dismissed her with a gesture, went in search of Lady Caroline to complain. She had been under the impression that Lady Caroline ordered the meals and therefore was responsible for the prices, but now it appeared that the cook had been left to do exactly as she pleased ever since they got there, which of course was simply disgraceful. Scrap was not in her bedroom, but the room, on Mrs. Fisher's opening the door, for she suspected her of being in it and only pretending not to hear the knock, was still flower-like from her presence. "Scent," sniffed Mrs. Fisher, shutting it again. And she wished Carlyle could have had 5 minutes straight talk with this young woman. And yet, perhaps, even he... She went downstairs to go into the garden in search of her, and in the hall encountered Mr. Wilkins. He had his hat on, and was lighting a cigar. Indulgent as Mrs. Fisher felt towards Mr. Wilkins, and peculiarly and even mystically related after the previous morning's encounter, she yet could not like a cigar in the house. Out of doors she endured it, but it was not necessary, when out of doors was such a big place, to indulge the habit indoors. Even Mr. Fisher, who had been, she should say, a man originally tenacious of habits, had quite soon after marriage got out of this one. However, Mr. Wilkins, snatching off his hat on seeing her, instantly threw the cigar away. He threw it into the water a great jar of arum lilies presumably contained, and Mrs. Fisher, aware of the value men attached to their newly lit cigars, could not but be impressed by this immediate and magnificent amende honorable. But the cigar did not reach the water. It got caught in the lilies, and smoked on by itself among them, a strange and depraved-looking object. "Where are you going to, my began Mr. Wilkins, advancing towards Mrs. Fisher, but he broke off just in time. Was it morning spirits impelling him to address Mrs. Fisher in the terms of a nursery rhyme? He wasn't even aware that he knew the thing. Most strange. What could have put it, at such a moment, into his self-possessed head? He felt great respect for Mrs. Fisher, and would not for the world have insulted her by addressing her as a maid, pretty or otherwise. He wished to stand well with her. She was a woman of parts, and also, he suspected, of property. At breakfast they had been most pleasant together, and he had been struck by her apparent intimacy with well-known persons. Victorians, of course, but it was restful to talk about them after the strain of his brother-in-law's Georgian parties on Hampstead Heath. He and she were getting on famously, he felt. She already showed all the symptoms of presently wishing to become a client. Not for the world would he offend her. He turned a little cold at the narrowness of his escape. She had not, however, noticed. "You are going out," he said very politely, all readiness should she confirm his assumption to accompany her. "I want to find Lady Caroline," said Mrs. Fisher, going towards the glass door leading into the top garden. "An agreeable quest," remarked Mr. Wilkins. "May I assist in the search?" "Allow me," he added, opening the door for her. "She usually sits over in that corner behind the bushes," said Mrs. Fisher, "and I don't know about it being an agreeable quest. She has been letting the bills run up in the most terrible fashion, and needs a good scolding." "Lady Caroline?" said Mr. Wilkins, unable to follow such an attitude. "What has Lady Caroline, if I may inquire, to do with the bills here?" "The housekeeping was left to her, and as we all share it alike, it ought to have been a matter of honour with her." "But Lady Caroline housekeeping for the party here? A party which includes my wife? My dear lady, you render me speechless. Do you not know she is the daughter of the Droitwiches?" "Oh, is that who she is?" said Mrs. Fisher, scrunching heavily over the pebbles towards the hidden corner. "Well, that accounts for it. The muddle that man Droitwich made in his department in the war was a national scandal. It amounted to misappropriation of the public funds." "But it is impossible, I assure you, to expect the daughter of the Droitwiches," began Mr. Wilkins earnestly. "The Droitwiches," interrupted Mrs. Fisher, "are neither here nor there. Duties undertaken should be performed. I don't intend my money to be squandered for the sake of any Droitwiches." A headstrong old lady, perhaps not so easy to deal with as he'd hoped. But how wealthy! Only the consciousness of great wealth would make her snap her fingers in this manner at the Droitwiches. Lottie, on being questioned, had been vague about her circumstances, and had described her house as a mausoleum with goldfish swimming about in it. But now he was sure she was more than very well off. Still, he wished he had not joined her at this moment, for he had no sort of desire to be present at such a spectacle as the scolding of Lady Caroline Dester. Again, however, he was reckoning without Scrap. Whatever she felt when she looked up and beheld Mr. Wilkins discovering her corner on the very first morning, nothing but angelicness appeared on her face. She took her feet off the parapet on Mrs. Fisher sitting down on it, and listening gravely to her opening remarks as to her not having any money to fling about in reckless and uncontrolled household expenditure, interrupted her flow by pulling one of the cushions from behind her head and offering it to her. "Sit on this," said Scrap, holding it out. "You'll be more comfortable." Mr. Wilkins leapt to relieve her of it. "Oh, thanks," said Mrs. Fisher, interrupted. It was difficult to get into the swing again. Mr. Wilkins inserted the cushion solicitously between the slightly raised Mrs. Fisher and the stone of the parapet, and again she had to say, "Thanks." It was interrupted. Besides, Lady Caroline said nothing in her defence. She only looked at her, and listened with the face of an attentive angel. It seemed to Mr. Wilkins that it must be difficult to scold a Dester who looked like that, and so exquisitely said nothing. Mrs. Fisher, he was glad to see, gradually found it difficult herself, for her severity slackened, and she ended by saying lamely, "You ought to have told me you were not doing it." "I didn't know you thought I was," said the lovely voice. "I would now like to know," said Mrs. Fisher, "what you propose to do for the rest of the time here." "Nothing," said Scrap, smiling. "Nothing? Do you mean to say—" "If I may be allowed, ladies," interposed Mr. Wilkins in his suavest professional manner, "to make a suggestion." They both looked at him, and remembering him as they first saw him, felt indulgent. "I would advise you not to spoil a delightful holiday with worries over housekeeping." "Exactly," said Mrs. Fisher. "It is what I intend to avoid." "Most sensible," said Mr. Wilkins. "Why not, then," he continued, "allow the cook, an excellent cook, by the way, so much a head per diem," Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in Latin, "and tell her that, for this sum, she must cater for you, and not only cater, but cater as well as ever. One could easily reckon it out. The charges of a moderate hotel, for instance, would do as a basis, halved, or perhaps even quartered.
"And this week that has just passed?" asked Mrs. Fisher. "The terrible bills of this first week. What about them?"
"They shall be my present to San Salvatore," said Scrap, who didn't like the idea of Lottie's nest egg being reduced so much beyond what she was prepared for. There was a silence. The ground was cut from under Mrs. Fisher's feet.
"Of course, if you choose to throw your money about," she said at last,
disapproving, but immensely relieved, while Mr. Wilkins was wrapped in the contemplation of the precious qualities of blue blood. This readiness, for instance, not to trouble about money, this free-handedness, it was not only what one admired in others perhaps more than anything else, but it was extraordinarily useful to the professional classes. When met with, it should be encouraged by warmth of reception. Mrs. Fisher was not warm. She accepted, from which he deduced that with her wealth went closeness, but she accepted grudgingly. Presents were presents, and one did not look them in this manner in the mouth, he felt. And if Lady Caroline found her pleasure in presenting his wife and Mrs. Fisher with their entire food for a week, it was their part to accept gracefully. One should not discourage gifts. On behalf of his wife, then, Mr. Wilkins expressed what she should wish to express, and remarking to Lady Caroline, with a touch of lightness, for so should gifts be accepted in order to avoid embarrassing the donor, that she had, in that case, been his wife's hostess since her arrival. He turned almost gaily to Mrs. Fisher and pointed out that she and his wife must now jointly write to Lady Caroline the customary letter of thanks for hospitality. "A Collins," said Mr. Wilkins, who knew what was necessary in literature. "I prefer the name Collins for such a letter to either that of board and lodgings or bread and butter. Let us call it a Collins." Scrap smiled, and held out her cigarette case. Mrs. Fisher could not help being mollified. A way out of waste was going to be found, thanks to Mr. Wilkins, and she hated waste quite as much as having to pay for it. Also, a way was found out of housekeeping. For a moment she had thought that if everybody tried to force her into housekeeping on her brief holiday by their own indifference, Lady Caroline, or inability to speak Italian, the other two, she would have to send for Kate Lumley after all. Kate could do it. Kate and she had learnt Italian together. Kate would only be allowed to come on condition that she did do it. But this was much better, this way of Mr. Wilkins's. Really a most superior man. There was nothing like an intelligent, not too young man for profitable and pleasurable companionship, and when she got up, the business for which she had come being settled, and said she now intended to take a little stroll before lunch, Mr. Wilkins did not stay with Lady Caroline, as most of the men she had known would, she was afraid, have wanted to. He asked to be permitted to go and stroll with her, so that he evidently, definitely preferred conversation to faces. A sensible, companionable man. A clever, well-read man. A man of the world. A man. She was very glad indeed she had not written to Kate the other day. What did she want with Kate? She had found a better companion. But Mr. Wilkins did not go with Mrs. Fisher because of her conversation, but because, when she got up, and he got up because she got up, intending merely to bow her out of the recess, Lady Caroline had put her feet upon the parapet again, and arranging her head sideways in the cushions, had shut her eyes. The daughter of the Droitwiches desired to go to sleep, and it was not for him, by remaining, to prevent her.